have a short demo on building a model in SageMaker. So I'm going to actually take over the screen. Okay, so before I hop into that, I just wanted to show the SageMaker console. It kind of has everything that we just talked about laid right out here. So there's ground truth, which is comprised of labeling jobs, labeling data sets, and workforces. So this is just our EDT sort of mess around account, so there's not much in this one. But you'd be able to create your labeling jobs here. Just give us some information. Task category, you have image, text, and custom for things that don't fall into either image or text. And then you sort of just go through this, go right through this, click everything that works, and then just start your training job. You have like image classification, multi-label image classification, semantic segmentation. So there's all kinds of options there. Then we have the notebooks, which is actually what we're going to use in just a minute. Your training jobs, algorithms, which this would store your, if we had any in here, but we don't. So if we were to create our own algorithms, this is where those would be stored. Training jobs, which we'll be creating momentarily. Hyperparameter tuning jobs. This is the where the automatic hyperparameter tuning happens. And then these are the options for your the inference models. So I'm just going to hop right into the notebook that I created, and we're going to go through sort of a machine learning lifecycle. Notebook instances. So Pittsburgh AI Webinar. This is a MLT2 large instance. Unlike Glue, this actually is not serverless. You do have to, pick your instance type, and it does stay up until you take it down. So that's important to keep in mind. So I've already put this in here. This is a blazing text classification example, and what blazing text is just a supervised text algorithm. It does text classification based on, I'll show you what the classes are and then be able to show you how we pass in a example piece of text, and it'll tell us what class that it classifies it as. So I'm just going to hop right in here. Okay. And I can actually share this out too if people want to mess around with it themselves. So just to recap, a text classification algorithm, essentially what it does is you train the model given X number of records of text, raw, unstructured text, and each of these records has a label, a classification label. Whether that is, for sentiment analysis, positive, negative, neutral, or in this case, it's actually a category, and I'll show you what those categories are in just a moment. But just to start here, I'm going to click through these. This is written actually in Python. It imports the SageMaker package that's built right in here. And when I run this, essentially what it's doing is creating a service role for me. And what this service role does is it makes sure that this notebook has access to the data stored in S3, so we can actually download it and use it to train the model. Quick command here, I'm going to run this, gets the data from GitHub, which is what this example uses. So download that data. We're going to have to unzip the data set that contains these CSV files, CSV and text files. We're going to want to look at some examples of the data. So now we see this particular record. I'm just going to highlight over it so you can see what a record looks like. This is the classification. It's just in number form right now, but we're going to actually change that into text form so we actually know what we're talking about in just a minute. And these two pieces here are the text, the free text that are going to be used to send in the blazing text algorithm. And then these just happen to all be of class 1, but there are several. So this is the text. So you could think class 1 is actually company in text form. And what this next piece of code does is essentially links number 1 to company, number 2 to educational institution, 3 to artist, and so on. So I'm just going to run this again, and we'll see that mapping right here. So if I have a string of text and now the classification is artist, then when I feed that text into the model, it's going to go, okay, these are the components of this text, and this is an artist. And with enough data, it will learn, what an artist is with some level of error, always. So I'm going to download or import some packages here. This simply does some pre-processing because the blazing text algorithm expects the data to be fed to it in a very specific format, which is what I said before. Sometimes even after you do an ETL job in Glue and you've maybe, let's say for text, you've removed all of the common words like the and, or, the, and then you've maybe even done some pre-processing to try to correct some spelling. Maybe you've tried to normalize terms or stemmed or lamentize some terms. Even after that, you're not guaranteed to have your data in a format that SageMaker is going to be able to use. So oftentimes you're doing just a little reformatting, not necessarily data cleansing, but at least reformatting. Okay. Just going to run through this real quick. Let's just. This is just calling this functions. Okay, now I am going to put the reformatted data back into S3. And now we're actually getting to the fun part in just a minute. That was sort of just setup work. Now we're actually going to train a model, and I'm going to be able to show you that training job actually executing in the console. So I have to get the region name. And then this simple line of code right here is going to spin up the resources that we need, or that creates the container. And then this will actually try to fit our data to the blazing text model. Set the hyperparameter. Click through this, and I will be able to show. Then I can go over here into the training jobs, and I will see that there is a new training job right here that is going to start doing its job. So while this stuff happens, because some of this stuff takes a few minutes, I'd be happy to take any questions or anything like that about the general process. I know it's a lot. There's a lot going on in this document, so if there's any questions about what's going on here, I'd be happy to try to clear things up. And also, I'll share this out so people can mess with it themselves if they want to.
Just generally to start with, how many attempts did it take you to actually feel like you understood the process, Ryan?
Of this particular one?
Yeah, I feel like a lot of times when I start to get into things, the first few times I have to keep coming back to the recipe. Like I have to keep coming back to like a bulleted list. And then eventually I start feeling like I can kind of do it from memory. Is this sort of the same, or is everything different? Or what was your experience as someone who was learning it?
Yeah, so conceptually, my background's in this stuff. So I already had the concepts of machine learning and AI pretty solidified in my mind. Now, doing it in SageMaker, coming from more of that traditional train your own model. I used to write my own models quite often, just coding them myself. So coming from that to using SageMaker to sort of streamline the process and just make it a lot better. It takes a little bit of time, but once you get it, it's a lot better than doing it the old way. I'll say that. Just getting understanding of the console, you know, how to quickly click through things and start up a training cycle, and, you know, deal with, you know, how the different types of inference servers work. It doesn't take a great deal of time, especially for somebody who has a little bit of a background in machine learning, because really the most difficult part of machine learning has always been the concepts. But once you just have the core concepts down, SageMaker is really easy to use.
Yeah, see, with this group, I think one of the conversations that we keep back to is sort of like, how do you take someone who wants to be involved and move them to that next stage where they're actually trying and practicing? And, you know, I think a lot of people are wearing multiple hats in the process, right? So they maybe are a developer of a different kind, or, you know, they're a startup founder and that sort of a thing. And, you know, learning it doesn't necessarily entail the same education that you had coming in. So sometimes it doesn't feel necessarily like a shorter, faster path than the old way, because they never learned the old way in the first place.
Yeah, I would say this. If you're staying on the level 1 and level 2 of the AWS machine learning stack, you can avoid a lot of the necessity to get deep, as opposed to if you're going to start running TensorFlow on SageMaker. If you're going to be using the SageMaker algorithms, then really what you would do is you'd have to go onto Amazon's own documentation, think about what your problem is first. Look at what the algorithms. I mean, I would always recommend doing an hour, you know, of just machine learning fundamentals on YouTube or something like that, because the fundamentals don't take a terribly long time to get your mind around. And then after that, find out what problem you want to solve. Then go right onto the documentation for SageMaker, and they really will explain in English, you know, in plain English a lot of the times, which algorithms essentially accomplish which type of goals. And then it comes down to understanding what hyperparameters you are going to be caring about the most. And that is sort of a trial and error. I mean, ultimately, if you're not using one of the out-of-the-box solutions on tier 1 of the machine learning stack, it's going to still be, you know, there still is some level of trial and error with this stuff, because, you know, SageMaker makes it a lot easier, but we're still dealing with a relatively complicated topic. Machine learning is still not, you know, able to be made so simple unless you're using it out of the box, but it's a lot better than what it would be otherwise.
I appreciate the insight, man. It's hard for some people maybe to learn, you know, long way around, and then we kind of democratize these tools and make them easier. And I don't know, we lose some of the context, I think.
Right. Yeah, no, totally understand. Totally understand. Yeah, sometimes it's coming, sometimes I came from this field, so I have to step back sometimes, you know, sometimes you just think, you know, if I didn't have this background, what would this mean for me? And I still think, even thinking on that high level, I still think that this is something that could be picked up really with a moderate amount of self-education on whatever organization's team wants to implement this. But if you're already dealing with data and you have, you know, some time, if just to maybe do some quick YouTube tutorials, I'll say this for sure. Machine learning, because of the tools that are available in 2020, does not require a master's level or a PhD. That's for sure. And I think a lot of people have the misconception that AI/ML is reserved for mathematics experts and computer science expert, you know, people who are really deep into the actual mathematics of computer science, it's not that way anymore. It's mainly about putting in the effort to understand the concepts of machine learning, because a lot of the heavy lifting, even on the tier 3, the bottom of the AWS machine learning tier, even if you were to go there, that doesn't even require a PhD or even master's understanding. I mean, it just, the material's out there, and it's that even those frameworks do a lot of the heavy lifting for you. So I would not want to discourage any organization for trying to pick this stuff up and implementing it to make their business easier.
I appreciate it, Ryan.
Okay.
Right. Any other questions that people want to throw Ryan's way?
Yeah, I'll certainly field more, but I will let everyone know that the training job has completed. So that's cool. Now what we want to do, I'm not going to do any tuning on this thing because we don't have time. It takes some time to do, so I'm not going to do that. But now that that training model is done, we're essentially going to host this inference model. We're going to just kick this off. Oh, I have to actually kick it off first. Yeah, there we go. So this is actually deploying. It's taking this training job that just took 3 minutes to train, and it is actually going to be hosted right here. This is one of those HTTP endpoints. This will stay, once this thing creates and it's done coming up, it's going to persist until I take it down. So it's important, if anybody goes on the SageMaker and is playing with this stuff and learning, make sure that you understand which resources don't go away unless you tell them to, because I don't want anybody to be surprised by their AWS bill. So it's just something to keep in mind. Be careful. Set alarms on the account if you can. And it just requires a level of just paying attention. That's all I would say.
Yeah, that is what what they refer to as a provision service as opposed to just a serverless service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, this is going to take, I mean, this is the very last part of the demo. This might take another 5 minutes, so feel free, more questions. I'd love to chat. I hope this was overall informative.
I'm curious, Ryan, from the perspective of kind of automation. Clearly this whole thing is automated through that notebook. Are there any other options for automation?
Yeah. So the notebook is really just, it just has a lot of the packages built in, but the notebook's no more than a Python environment, right? At least the way I'm using it, it's no more than a Python environment. So if you wanted to get that SageMaker Python package and use it elsewhere, you absolutely could. If you want to make, like, for example, the next thing I'm going to do is make an API call to that inference. That obviously that call can be made from anywhere. The notebooks are really just there because they're built to, especially because they're used a lot of time for some data pre-processing. You're not going to always want to do that stuff in like a Lambda because the compute power is not going to be enough to fly over millions of records often and do things with that data. Going to have timeouts. But yeah, to answer your question, you don't have to necessarily use the notebooks. It just makes sense because of they're built for data processing. Does that answer your question, or were you asking something else?
No, it does. I didn't know if there was ever the case where you maybe that data that you were using to create this model, that's not necessarily a real-time feed, but maybe it's updated ever so often, whether it's a public data set or not. Is there a way that we could, say that public data set is updated? Can we find a way to trigger on that update and feed it into our model to update our inference model? Yeah.
So there is a whole, there are ways in SageMaker to retrain your models based, with new data, for sure. Yeah, that's a very common thing. You'll see drift in models from time to time over time because things in the real world have changed. So you do hear quite often of organizations or individuals having to retrain their models because the inference model was working quite well at one point, but after the span of a few months or a year, you start to see the performance go down because you haven't trained it on the most recent data. You're essentially about an outdated model. So that's a big part of maintaining a machine learning inference model, is to retrain it when needed.
Maybe how dogs look has changed over time. We need to update
It
accordingly.
could. There could be new breeds. Dogs could start to look like, other animals. You never know.
That is a terrible example. Dustin, I assume actually you're probably starting to touch on the conversation that we've had in the past about Pittsburgh AI's background as like AI for good, alignment with the UN goals, things like that. And when you start talking about like publicly available data sets, something that we actually like toyed with using for this program, because, the AI for good and the ways in which we can use publicly available data sets, anyone can kind of grab a hold of that, but the data might release once a week, once a month, once a day. Is that what you're kind of referring to?
Yeah, or just, anything that, we might want to keep an updated model about, whether that was a public data set or it's just data that we're being fed. I could definitely see the case as, a private organization where they might have some model internally that's based on, incoming data from some of their clients all the time. Just being able to get rid of that processing overhead or that operating overhead.
Kenny once mentioned to me, Kenny, I don't know if you can unmute for a second and jump into this part of the conversation.
Yeah.
How there is at least in Pittsburgh, a civic data set. I don't necessarily know what's in it. Maybe there's someone that, here in the train that is involved with that. But can you talk about sort of some of those models? And while we have the guys here, I'd be interested to find out sort of what public data sets even exist, and then just let them riff off of that for one moment.
Yeah, absolutely. So, a lot of people don't know, but on the first day of in office for Mayor Peduto back in 2014, one of the first things he signed into legislation was the creation of a open data repository and kind of infrastructure for not just the city, but the region in southwestern Pennsylvania. And so they took a fairly unique model in developing what they now call the Western Pennsylvania Regional Data Center. This is something that I worked on with them for a period of time that I was employed by the city. But essentially an effort, similar to other open data initiatives around the world, but unique in the sense that it's a partnership between the city of Pittsburgh, the 10-county region in southwestern Pennsylvania, as well as the University of Pittsburgh and Carnegie Mellon University, to get people sourcing publicly available data sets and support the various departments, whether it's the 23 departments of the city of Pittsburgh. Oh, I think it's 24 now, with a couple new ones that have been added, as well as municipal governments regionally. So you get things like public safety data or 311 data, things that are all very pertinent now during this COVID-19 set of challenges that we have. And not only has that process of maintaining the regional data center been valuable for civic coders or other people trying to develop solutions, it's also improved the actual internal processes for city departments themselves, going from paper filing or weekly publishing via PDF into much more usable, machine readable formats and friendly for the kind of updating that people need to actually build something valuable out of it. And so there's a group called Code for Pittsburgh, which is essentially a volunteer core of civic coders that develop applications out of this. But they're always looking for more people to do more with this data that's been collected.
So would you say this is an opportunity for people who are trying to get into this stuff to get some real life hands-on, meaningful use cases on this stuff?
Absolutely. I think, a lot of times when people are engaging, whether it's in workshops like we have today or otherwise, and their business or organization have not signed on to, leveraging machine learning or things for their own organizational data, tapping into this kind of open data resource is a really compelling way for anybody from the interested general public to try things out. And then Greg also added in the chat that there is regularly recurring meetups, at least on a weekly basis, whether they're doing things like sourcing public sector meetings that are happening, or developing resources for 412 food rescue in food redistribution and other kind of stuff. It's there's an entire community that people can tap into here that's always looking for more people.
Excellent. I'm actually interested. Very cool. So how often are those data repositories updated?
That one's a good question. I think the website might be wprdc.org or something like that. For most,
I'll track it down. I'll put it in the chat.
Yeah.
Right, thanks, Scott.
Yeah, it's been a while since I've been in there. But for most major things, you can expect at least annual updates, and otherwise, yeah, it'd have to go in.
But ultimately, we end up with new data sets and then some data that can be used for modeling, depending on what the application is.
Yeah, it just sounds like an excellent opportunity to get people who are interested in this type of thing, to be able to get hands-on with this stuff and do it for a purpose, a greater purpose, so to speak.
It is in the chat. Kenny beat me to it.
Oh yeah, sorry about that, Scott.
We're all going to be fine. I'm allowed to be shown up every once in a while.
Yeah. Should I finish this demo? The thing is up in service now.
Yeah, sorry to have taken so long on that. I just
sorry from my perspective. That took forever to get that thing up.
No, but it's interesting because, like, again, when we were going to do this in person as a live conversation, we really did want to touch on this, code for and the UN goals and those kinds of things. So I'm really glad we got to work them in.
No, for sure. It's excellent. All right, so now we see that the inference model's up. Took about 5 or 10 minutes to get up. Now, let's say we want to pass in this. Let me get this thing out there. This is our record that we're going to be testing with. It's talking about aircraft manufacturing and spacecraft. We're going to tokenize this record, which pretty much just means we're going to split it up into different words. Then we're going to pass it to the inference model. And it's telling us that this is most likely talking about a company or an educational institution. And these are the probabilities that it's decided how accurate it thinks it is. So you could imagine if you're writing an application, let's say your application needs text processing to perform some functionality, but you don't want to return to the user a response that isn't most likely accurate. You could write into your code if that probability is less than, say, 70% or 0.7 or something, to maybe say result not found or something like that. So this is what you typically get back from these models. You'll get the labels that it assigns and its probability that that it's accurate. So I hope that this was helpful. I know it was a fast demo, but yeah, that's a simple classification using Amazon SageMaker. And I would imagine going from scratch from all the way at the beginning, if you were just writing this out, this is probably for somebody who has a little bit of a background, probably a few hours to get this straightened out and trained and, get up for testing. So thank you for letting me demo that. I'm actually just going to use this code right here to kill that endpoint, and that'll take care of that for me. So we are at the Q&A portion.
I think we might have answered everyone's questions. We'll give a last call. In the meantime, we do have a brief survey. If you have a few minutes, it should take no more than 2 minutes of your time to take. I'll also put it in the chat box, but we definitely love any feedback that you have for us. And thank you guys so much for taking the time to join us today.